If you're a busy clean energy professional like me working in sub-Saharan Africa, then you would know how difficult it is to get news about our industry. You're probably following all the blogs and LinkedIn pages just to get up-to-date news. Well, we have a solution for that now. We're launching a newsletter called Clean Energy Africa that will deliver news about the clean energy sector in sub-Saharan Africa directly to your inbox 2 times a month. If you would like to subscribe to get up-to-date news and stay on top of everything happening in the industry, then check out the link on the top of our show notes to sign up to our newsletter. Now to the episode. Hello and welcome to the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olubunmi Olajide. On this podcast, we tell the story of sub-Saharan Africa's energy transition, focusing first on the financiers, policymakers, and operators that are driving us towards a sustainable energy future. On this episode, we're speaking with Chude, who is the Director of Blended Finance at GreenMax Capital. GreenMax Capital plays a very important step, providing alternative financing to the decentralized renewable energy space. On this episode, we'll be hearing from Chude about what it takes to finance large clean energy infrastructure projects, and from his experience moving from the traditional energy sector to now focusing exclusively on clean energy. Now let's jump into this conversation with Chude telling us how he first got into the energy sector.
My name is Uwajeh, Ifechukwude. My first name is Ifechukwude, which some call Chude. That's the short form. I'm the Managing Director of Blended Finance at GreenMax Capital Group. The Blended Finance Department, I primarily oversee our CI Africa mandate. Yeah, I started out doing project development, right? Large level project development. It's going to be quite a dirty word I'm going to mention, but I actually did coal power project development. Did some gas as well, large power projects. Frankly, it was fun because these were quite challenging projects and they wanted to move the needle in terms of the energy, bridging the energy or electricity deficit in the country. And for myself personally, this is what I call the bafflingly lethargic pace of electrification in Nigeria. Because with all of our resources, there's just no reason why the rate of electrification is this low. So that was a major cause of concern for me. Very frustrating. And so I was glad to put my hands into doing what I could to add some megawatts to the national. So I did that for quite a bit and then transitioned to clean energy advisory when I determined that, yes, I do want to move the needle, but let's move the needle sustainably. So following my clean energy advisory foray, I took up a transitional advisory position at GreenMax Capital Advisors. GreenMax Capital Advisors, I did advisory for both on-grid and off-grid projects, and off-grid to not just mini-grids, but also distributed solar and so on. So we did a lot of work preparing companies for finance. So just basically getting them finance ready and also raising capital for these companies, for their companies and businesses and projects in the clean energy space. I've done consulting work as well in my role at GreenMax, power generation, distribution, including this very somewhat unique aspect of distribution in Nigeria, which is the new distribution franchising, what I would say describe as a carve-out, done regulatory consulting as well. And my current role is in fund management business at GreenMax Capital Group, where I am the MD. And again, as I mentioned earlier, one of my key responsibilities here is overseeing the Smart Outcomes Fund, which provides results-based grants for mini-grids and productive use energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa.
In your role at GreenMax, I understand that it's primarily fund management, but you have a host of other initiatives you run with partners, and that has greatly influenced the way your work generates. So why did you use the word creativity when it comes to finance in this space?
I use the word creative because these are requirements to solve the challenge, right? To solve the energy access challenge, right? There are unique circumstances, unique situations in projects in sub-Saharan Africa that require their own tailor-made solutions, right? And so in some cases, you need bespoke solutions, and in other cases, not so bespoke, right? So think about it. Even in the West, like countries like the United States actually applied subsidies. Some find this quite interesting, applied subsidies in the development of rural electrification to enable last mile access. I think that started somewhere around 80 plus years ago, give or take. Yeah. There's if we look at liability gap support from like equipment subsidies, like equipment or in-kind subsidies or results-based grants, we're not really doing anything very, very new. However, when we look at productive uses, because our general economic situation in sub-Saharan Africa is somewhat more unique, right? So it's not enough to have a mini grid developer build a mini grid which is supported, whether it's through in-kind grants or whether it's through results-based grants. You actually do need to figure out a way to support the improvement of economic outcomes in that community, right? Otherwise, what typically would happen is that your mini grid would be heavily underutilized. And then you go think for them, like, okay, let's support productive uses, right? Let's support the deployment of equipment, which would do a number of things, which would increase the capacity utilization of that mini grid and also result in improved revenue, whether it's through processing of food for further sale and so on and so forth, or a reduction in the amount of effort spent by rural dwellers in doing tasks which require a lot of effort, right? So there's that level of, I would say, creativity that one does need to apply to improve economic outcomes for the rural dwellers, improve capacity utilization. And that's where the productive uses come in. Even in the deployment of productive use solutions or productive use type business models, there's a number of ways that could play out, right? You have output-based subsidy support for productive uses, or you could go further to something more experimental, like what we do at CA Africa with Smart Outcomes Fund component, where you have an outcome-based grant, right? So you're improving the actual livability index of the people there, and that's like the impact targets which are measured. Things like I mentioned, which are the amount of time spent on doing so and so work, the improvement in livelihoods and so on. So there is more outcome-based targets which are intended to be achieved.
You mentioned about the rural electrification drive that happened in the US. It's actually this book called The Power Program that goes into all of that and how all the major corporations were formed largely off those government-driven subsidy programs aimed at extending their grid connections. And specific to the African market and specific to your role as well, the term blended finance gets thrown around a lot. And I want to understand, I just want you to explain to the audience, what is blended finance and how does it fit into the thesis that GreenMax uses when it invests in renewable energy assets?
I know there are quite a few definitions of blended finance. Let me just see if I can cobble one together that meets all those requirements. So basically, at its fundamental level, blended finance seeks to utilize pools of development finance and development finance and donor capital to unlock private capital, develop projects which achieve certain impacts without market distortion. Yeah, so it's not supposed to distort the market. It's supposed to unlock private capital in more asset markets. And there are quite a few. I gave that brief definition because there are quite a few blended finance instruments, even some which you would not typically think could be described in that manner. So I think the second part of your question was, how do we apply blended finance? And we've done that in quite a few ways. Let me pick the first, which is, let's use our Green for Access First Loss Fund, GreenMax Capital. So what that does is it, again, uses a blended finance instrument, a first loss fund, a first loss cover to unlock, let's say, to capitalize lending by local commercial financial institutions into with projects or portfolios of off-grid projects, right? So that's one. At CA Africa, we have a couple of blended finance instruments that we use. We apply some we have the results-based, output-based grants. We also have a unique product which is unique to Sierra Africa in that context anyway, which we call forgivable loan. It is also a blended finance instrument because it helps to unlock private capital. We developed something, a concept in the past called Green Street Africa, which was a very unique, innovative vehicle applied to the blended finance thesis model anyway, to electrify large public institutions such as tertiary institutions and tertiary level hospitals.
And when you describe the funds that GreenMax manages, does CEI just sit on its own as its own fund, or is it broken down into different ways you can deploy capital into different instruments?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so Sierra Africa is set up as a foundation, and it's implemented, the delivery is implemented by three partners, right? The foundation manager, the consortium is Triple Jump, GreenMax Capital Group, Persistent Energy Capital. So the way Sierra Africa is set up, right? It's set up as a one-stop shop. And when we say one-stop shop, what that means, how that translates or crystallizes into reality is there is a smart outcomes fund window, which is managed by GreenMax, which provides results-based grants, like I mentioned, for mini grids and productive use of energy, and also provides technical assistance, another blended finance instrument, also provides technical assistance to developers and applicants in the energy space in sub-Saharan Africa. And then on the other hand, we have what we call crowd lending window, right? The crowd lending window is implemented by Persistent Energy Capital and provides financing in the form of subordinated debt and some amount of equity, very smaller. The equity appetite is not very large, but it provides financing in the form of debt and equity to the off-grid space. Also provides some level of technical assistance. In that part, that's the crowd lending window of Sierra Africa. So the debt typically locks debt or senior debt from the crowd. So that's in its own another blended finance instrument that Sierra Africa deploys because it applies donor capital. We're funded by KfW, but let's say we're funded actually by BMZ through KfW. And so that's DFI public money, right? Which goes into Sierra Africa at the into the crowd lending window. And then for lending, that public capital from Sierra Africa forms the subordinate tranche in a debt deal. And the senior tranche is made up of crowd lending window debt, which in crowd lending window debt is actual individual private capital from European crowd lenders. So that's how that crowd lending window works. So you might ask the question, why do we call it a one-stop shop? So think about a project from financing to full delivery, right? So we're able to provide to developers a forgivable loan, pre-construction. We're also able to provide them with technical assistance where their applications have been maybe deficient. We're able to provide them with technical assistance to meet the qualification criteria under Sierra Africa. And then when they meet the qualification criteria, the crowd lending window is able to provide them with financing for construction financing for their projects. And then post-financing, RBF, results-based grant window for mini grids, provides results-based grants. All within one shop with all of the efficiencies associated without the necessity or need for multiple layers of intake, multiple intake assessments, right? It's just a single point of intake, which is applied throughout the entire program.
And is there a specific type of company at a specific stage that you typically look to support? And on average, what is the project size in kilowatts?
That's a pretty good question, right? So it depends. For instance, let's use the RBF component of Smart Outcomes Fund window, SOC window, which GreenMax implements. So the project supported to be of varying sizes, right? What we first do is to select the sub-Saharan African countries where we will deploy the products, we'll deploy this financing into the Sierra Africa initiative, right? And of course, for mini grids, that one of the key requirements is the availability of a mini grid regulatory regime, which supports mini grid development. And once that box is ticked, we don't have restrictions on the size of the projects. There's some, because of the amount of capital that we have, there is some restriction on what, the maximum tickets that could go to a single developer or to a single country, but we don't restrict in terms of size. Give you an example, right? I think it's already public online. You will see that we signed a grant agreement with a company like Nuro in DRC, which is deploying very large or metro grids. Imagine a mini grid that is over almost 4 megawatts, right? So that's a huge metro grids. Yeah. And then we're supporting other developers that have portfolios, smaller portfolios of 100 plus kW or thereabouts. So there's a wide range, and we're happy and comfortable to support the gamut of mini grid sizes.
This is Olu, host of the podcast, interrupting this episode to let you know that we're looking for sponsors to support our work covering the sustainable energy transition in sub-Saharan Africa. In the 5 years since starting this project, we've grown the platform to a top 10% ranked podcast globally, and we're looking to go even further. If your organization or fund would like to learn more about reaching thousands of engaged listeners monthly, then reach out to us with the email in the show notes of this episode. And for our listeners, you can continue to support us for free by sharing this episode with the people in your network, leaving a review in your favorite listening platform, and signing up to the newsletter linked in the show notes of this episode. Now, back to the conversation.
And are you seeing any bias emerge as the facility progresses? I bring this up because a few weeks ago, GreenMax's co-founder, Cliff, was on the Mini Grid Business Podcast hosted by Nicole Peter-Smith, who is a friend of the podcast as well. And he mentioned about basically a valley of death and how it's going to be difficult for some developers rather than others, some being local developers that probably don't have project financing support built in-house, and the larger developers who have more like an international or maybe like across a continental operational base. You can think of the larger developers that come to mind. And are you seeing a bias emerge in where the funding is going based on that?
Good question. Pretty good question. Okay. So I would hesitate to describe it as bias, but there is, of course, a very real pattern of funding flow. We have it as part of what we set out to do to support local companies under CA Africa. We're very, very passionate about supporting local companies. The larger international companies do have deeper pockets. They tend to have a lot more, the organizational structure and all of the other requirements to meet all the criteria, meet pre-qualification requirements under not just CA Africa's grant programs, and pretty much any grant program those criteria are typically easily met, or should I say more easily met by the foreign developers because of their deeper pockets and the ability to draw from financing from whether it's their parent companies or parent company domicile. So they have that advantage, right? And of course, as you're quite aware, one of the key challenges in the off-grid, like the mini-grid space, is that there's a serious dearth of equity. There's literally only a handful of actual investors doing deals in the equity in the mini-grid space. And then even for those that are doing deals, the number that are looking to do deals is even a lot smaller, right? And local developers having limited personal or private capital or limited capital mobilization ability, it makes it quite a bit more challenging for them to scale as fast. So they might qualify, but the number of sites, number of projects that they would be able to implement be a lot less than the international developers. However, I have to say this, that there is a caveat here, and this caveat is a positive one, that there are, I would argue that there's early stage project development support, which could actually make a huge difference. And I could you probably know I'm mostly based in Lagos, right? So in Nigeria, some local developers have actually done remarkably well, right? And
Yeah.
one of the reasons why, a couple of them have been able to do remarkably well is, as I mentioned, they have been able to leverage project development support from donor agencies. So they were aware of the support available from donor agencies, and they were able to leverage that support. I would argue, not argue, but state clearly here that what's arguably the two most prolific and most successful private mini-grid developers in Nigeria have been able to draw on donor support for project development activities and feasibility studies, which really catapulted them ahead of the rest of the pack. So it's not all doom and gloom. That's the basic one.
Yeah. And another angle of this, and the way I try to think about it, is we're looking at the outputs side, but what about the input side? Is part of this problem the fact that maybe not enough money is entering the sector? Obviously, facilities like yours exist, and they are serving like a really important need in terms of plugging the project financing gap and making it something that's actually viable for projects to go on to be successful, not just extracting short-term interest from the projects being deployed. But do we have a problem as an industry of attracting the right type of capital?
I think you asked two questions there. You asked whether the capital is sufficient, and then you asked whether it's the right type. I think there's a challenge on both fronts. There is a challenge. There's a clear challenge on both fronts. I think what's the electrification deficit in Africa? I think it's somewhere around 600 million or something of that number that is typically mentioned. And you've probably heard of the M300 initiative to to provide electricity access to 300 million Africans primarily sub-Saharan African by 2030, right? By the end of 2030, right?
Yes.
Think about what sort of financing will be required for 300 million, whether it's across different categories of electrification, whether it's on-grid, off-grid, whether it's microgrids, interconnected mini-grids, distributed solar, and so on and so forth. When you think about just how much it will take to electrify, to provide each one of those 300 million people with connections, you're looking at the financing requirement of in the hundreds, at least over $100 billion, right? So that's huge. So when you have that very rough number in mind, very plus or minus, have a very rough number, then you stop thinking about the second question, which you asked, is types of capital, right? You ask yourself, how much private capital do we have available in Africa for projects such as these? Typically, how much private capital is mobilized on an annual basis in Nigeria and then, in Africa, and then how much private capital would actually go to electrification type projects building there? Because it's not going to be all of it, right? Would be others, some money going to infra project, other infra projects, and so on and so forth. And then on the back of how much private capital that is needed, then you think about how much donor money is required to blend that private capital. And I don't have immediate numbers, but I can tell you based on the preliminary research that we've done, it will be a challenge. It's really an all hands on deck moment for that to be even remotely achievable. So to answer your question, difficult in terms of size, difficult in terms of sources.
So is this where the art comes to the work you do? Because I imagine that this is very highly technical, very highly driven by financials and financial models and long contracts for PPAs and all of that. But actually structuring these facilities like the ones you mentioned, the crowd lending window, smart outcomes, the result-based funds, is it more of an art form at this point to find the right balance that can serve the market?
Is it an art form? I don't think it's an art form. There's very specific steps to take, right? You're basically deploying GFI and donor capital to unlock private capital. And so the instruments that you're crafting or the instruments that you're deploying are based on the type of risk that you want to mitigate, right? So based on, and then the type of risk that is inherent is dependent on the type of project, category of project, and the market. right? So these are the steps that are taken to, I won't hesitate to say craft, but to select the sort of instruments to deploy. For instance, you would not be looking to deploy, you'll not be looking to implement a mini grid program in South Africa, right? It's not necessary, it's not needed there, right? So the market, the technology, and so on and so on. Market, technology, category of project basically will determine what sort of instrument you deploy. So again, just to process that, we're very hesitant about reinventing the wheel, right? There are a lot of really great blended finance instruments that are out there, which can be adapted to a number of scenarios, right? So we don't go out of our way just to say we want to do something new for the sake of doing something new. Where an instrument exists, which is adaptable, you would adapt it right to the market and the situation scenario is specific scenario. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I was to take like two giant leaps forwards from what you've said and draw a conclusion to the equity point, is the fact that equity is difficult to find in the market right now a commentary on the perception of risk associated with this sector?
It's a perception, a commentary on the perception of risk and return. So, and a couple of, so risk and return. And also I would add something which is unpopular, a lack of long-term clarity or financing. For instance, if you have in a market, that's whatever hypothetical market you want to choose, right? You have a market that has a grant program with a short term, right? So maybe that the term of the grant program for mini grids is maybe 4 or 5 years, right? And it just starts to pick up steam maybe at the end of the first year or the second year. That does not provide sufficient long-term, even medium-term clarity. But for an equity investor, the sort of investor that you would want to put that much touted and much needed patient capital, right? Which you want to, which is medium and long-term, right? So there just isn't enough clarity of horizon of what other grant programs potentially would be able to come into that market. So if a developer has prepared a portfolio of maybe 100 mini grids or some projects, we want to deploy them maybe over a 10-year period, go to the market looking for equity, and the investor takes a look at the portfolio and sees that the viability gap support in this market is only available for the next 3 years. What clarity do I have at this? What clarity, what assurances do I have that if I put this money, the rest of the portfolio is realizable? And you need that level of scale to begin to coalesce the sort of returns that would make sense to even an impact investor. Right? So there's that aspect, which is also a bit of a challenge which needs to be addressed. And again, that's one of the reasons why we understood that in designing CA Africa. So CA Africa has a much longer term outlook, and the foundation is set up to last until 2038.
That's really wonderful that you're looking at a much longer time horizon, and more to the way investors are looking at the sector. I think we are so focused on the energy transition, but there's also the aspect of energy security, which I know was a very large focus for you at the early part of your career. So how do you see that influencing the way facilities are designed now and the way financing is kind of like distributed throughout the sector? Is there a Africa first energy security plan in mind? Or is it more like, this is where we are right now and we just have to work with what the market has?
Well, I don't know that there's an Africa first energy security policy. I don't know that we are that coherent in terms of policy. Like, so only a couple of countries, like I think Nigeria, Ghana, I think those are the last ones I knew that had actual energy transition plans in place. So whether all of Africa would coherent energy plan, I can only say I wish that will happen. I don't know that ever will. So again, you mentioned energy security, energy transition, and I talked about the countries that have energy transition plans and so on. So something I have said a couple of times, even in the public space, is that if we're to have an honest discussion about sustainability, which I believe we are all passionate about, we have to find the nexus between energy security and the energy transition, right? In order for countries to actually articulate real plans that they can actually adhere to, all of the transition plans must take cognizance of public good and energy security. So I can't stress that or emphasize that enough. Otherwise, what will happen is, at the first sign of discomfort, people will simply roll back their strategies. All of the targets for EVs, even in the Western world, we see them beginning to move because their energy security is in certain areas is threatened, right? So that nexus again actually needs to be taken very seriously, so that we make commitments, the intention to keep to them.
And I guess another foundation that kind of lends very heavily to this discussion is the role of government in particular. Doing such large scale projects in renewables, you interact, I'm sure, a lot with a lot of the government stakeholders. So how have those relationships been? How is it managing those relationships? And how do you feel partnerships in general and the work you're doing?
Okay, well, we've had, I would say, pretty good interactions, relationships, partnerships, support from governments in the countries where we've deployed our instruments or where we provided support to projects and businesses. I'll give you a couple of examples, right? For instance, when we developed Green Streets Africa, which, as I mentioned, was a very, very innovative, unique platform to develop and finance electrification assets sustainably for large public institutions, right? So it was a model which was so innovative that it won the Climate Finance Lab's Energy Access Idea of the Year in 2020. Yeah, I think it was 2020, right? And so at the time we were looking at a local implementing partner, and of course, because the projects would be deployed to federal institutions, it made sense to have federal government partner in the implementation. The partner that we selected was the REA, right? And the then executive director of the Rural Electrification Fund was a key champion of Green Street Africa. And they actually did participate in the incubation of the Green Street idea concept and model for, I think it was around 6 months until it was formally ready for launch by CPI. So really, really great support that we received from that government counter there. Another example, and this is I'm giving different examples so you understand that not just in crafting instruments and not just in deploying financing, but even in advisory, right? When we advised what is currently the first IPP to close financing in Sierra Leone, we found the government be a very, very good counterpart. We had open book financial model negotiations with the government, with the representatives of the government, EDSA and AWRC in Sierra Leone. And they were quite frank and open about what the aspirations were. Let's bear in mind, government is not the boogeyman, right? The government actually wants and is under a lot of times under a lot more pressure than you as a private counterparty to deliver on their promises to the people. So in that case, we had a very good counterparty on the other side of the table in the government of Sierra Leone. And we achieved financial close. We brought on the financing, very innovative financing as well. What was the first on-grid project close financing? And it was a solar project as well in the country.
That is wonderful. Yeah. I'm curious, you've already given a few examples, but is there any one project within your time at GreenMax where you think back on and maybe you're sitting around the table with some colleagues that you just like to bring up now and then as a humble brag?
Well, the Sierra Leone project that I just mentioned, that's one that's really, really dear to my heart, right? And I say there are quite a few, but that one is really dear to my heart because I did travel extensively to Sierra Leone and I did visit the communities where the infrastructure was to be deployed, the Boama community in Sierra Leone. I understand very intimately, met the chief of the kingdom, right? Understand very, very intimately what the electrification challenge was for them, right? And I understood at the time, not sure what it is correct. At the time, it was just like the entire country had about 100 megawatts of generation capacity, of which at any time, of which I think it's a small country. Yeah, but of which at any time, somewhere around 60 or so megawatts was available. And that 60 megawatts was largely coming from this thermal plant on a ship, emergency power from a ship moored off the coast of Freetown, providing emergency power to the country, right? And that's why I understood the challenge what that brought to the people, the challenges to the public purse, the challenges in terms of lack of, like the electricity that was generated there didn't get to the hinterlands, just multifaceted challenges, right? And so it's one project which I am very, very, very glad to have seen to completion. And again, it was the partnership between partnership between a very, very intrepid developer in solar era, a willing government, a financier which was able to deploy donor capital in a manner that I would say was very, very, not just catalytic, but was done in a manner that would actually try to improve the quality of life of the people. So it was not just a numbers game. There was something about impact and the way in the thinking of the financier. And that I consider a huge plus.
That is a wonderful example. And it just goes to show the impact that GreenMax is having in the space. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And the last question we'd like to ask our guests, and we gave you some time to think about this too, is with all the work you're doing, the space is very impact driven. I kind of had to think back when you mentioned going to the community, because in one of my previous roles, I also had this experience of going to a community and then having to go back to the office to start working on contracts and financial models and planning tariffs, and having the feeling kind of like an obligation that I really want this project to get deployed. So there's that like element of being personally invested at a point in the project being successful. So with all this in mind and all the amazing work GreenMax is doing, how do you define failure in your work?
Failure. Not a word I like to think of, and I should think about in my daily blog, typically part of my lexicon. Okay. But I think I'll define failure. Failure will be twofold, actually. Failure, on the one hand, will be not planning for electrification, or planning for future electrification with sustainability in mind, right? And the second would be a failure to articulate what I've already summarized earlier, a nexus between energy security and the energy transition. So the reason why I mentioned the former, which I mentioned failure to plan sustainably, when we're implementing electrification initiatives, it's really, really sad to see whether it's a mini grid or whether it's distributed solutions that are working perfectly for the first year, second year, at the end of the day, there is maybe at the end of the third year or something, the power goes off, lights go out, because for a number of reasons, maybe there's just no incentive for the developer, operator, owner to continue to implement or continue to maintain and reach that plant. So that would be that's a huge challenge, right? Think about what the goals of M300. If M300 succeeds in electrifying 300 million people, ready access to 300 million people by 2030, and then what happens if maybe 3 years after that, half of those people are back to square one? And then we need another M150 or MX to get them to electrify those individuals or those communities, right? So that for me is a major challenge. That's what I would consider as outright failure, right? So we need to align technical requirements, financing. So when we talk about long-term financing, it's not just because it's typically more affordable. It is also because when financing is long-term, right, it incentivizes the financier and the developer project's operator to work in unison to continue to maintain and operate the project, to operate as it sustainably and to deliver the promises to the people. And so we need to think about sustainability in terms of financing, sustainability in terms of technical requirements and technical criteria for the projects or initiatives being deployed. For just buttressing the point I made is of the latter, which is about the need for a nexus between energy security and the energy transition. I think our net zero goals in Nigeria, we aim for net zero sometime around 2060, if I'm correct. Very ambitious goals. And because of the global push for net zero, right, I'm sure you're quite aware, there's already a very, very marked reduction in the availability of financing for even projects or initiatives which are needed by certain countries under the energy transition plans. To give you an example, there are a good number of financiers that will not touch gas, right? They will not touch gas projects, right? But gas is an integral part of our transition plan, right? So in order to stay on course in our transition plans, right, we need to have certain types of financing and then transition largely entirely to renewables, right? So that's the thinking around energy security. And that's one of the thoughts or thinking around energy security and the energy transition. They have to be thought of in unison, right? Again, the likes of the African Development Bank and the number of other donors are doing awesome work in trying to create green base load projects, right? So in order for this mission or for these targets to be achieved and realized, you have to consider the energy security of whatever country, whatever markets that initiative has been put. And again, this does not apply strictly to Sub-Saharan Africa. It does not apply strictly to Africa. It applies globally. Countries will roll back their transition goals when their livelihoods or the quality of their livelihoods are threatened, right? So again, careful planning is key. We can't afford to get this wrong.
Thank you for listening to the episode. We're going to be publishing a few more really interesting conversations, so make sure that you're subscribed wherever you listen to the podcast. And also, if you want to listen to another very good podcast on blended finance, I recommend an episode from the Mini Good Business podcast called Impact and Reach. And Nico, the host of the podcast, speaks with Cliff, who is the founder of GreenMax Capital, and also John Oko, who is from the African Mini Grid Developers Association. They have a very detailed conversation about structuring funds that can support mini grid developers and about how you can bridge the gaps for local mini grid developers in particular. So that'll be in the show notes, and I highly recommend you give it a listen as well. And until next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and see you on the next episode. Bye for now.